8 years. That was how long Rachel Monroe had wandered through every alley and shadow of Chicago, chasing fragments of a trail that seemed to lead nowhere, or at least that was what everyone believed. Her father had vanished the moment she turned 18. No warning, no note, no trace of what had happened. The police called it an accident and closed the file within a few weeks. The city called it an ending. But for Rachel, it was a cover-up, plain and deliberate. From that moment on, she lived each day as if the truth itself depended on her persistence. No one stood by her. Her mother was too heartbroken to even hear his name again. Her friends thought she was obsessed. Even her colleagues shook their heads when she spoke about the scattered clues she had gathered over the years. But Rachel knew something was wrong. A man like her father, Richard Monroe, didn't simply disappear from the face of the earth. He had worked in city infrastructure development, handling real estate contracts and redevelopment projects in forgotten neighborhoods. Nothing in his life hinted that he would abandon everything, least of all his daughter. Rachel had chosen journalism not out of passion but because it gave her permission to dig deeper, to uncover what the city had buried, to reopen cases the world had chosen to forget. She wrote modest reports on urban planning, public budgets, and petty corruption, anything that would grant her access to documents, maps, and the people who might know something. And then, slowly, the pieces began to appear. Not quickly, not clearly. But since the year 2017, Rachel noticed a strange pattern of disappearances tied to an organization that seemed perfectly legitimate on paper: construction workers, accountants, transport drivers, office clerks, all employed by companies linked to the same elusive group. She traced property files, construction permits, budget allocations. Everything looked spotless. Too spotless. Yet when she reached out to the families of the missing, she discovered they had not moved states or quit their jobs, as the records claimed. They had vanished, and their loved ones had no answers. Every path led to one name: Vincent D'Angelo, 38 years old, a Levin estate magnate, a man who appeared in charity auctions and investigative pieces about organized crime, handsome in a dangerous way, polished in a way that made trust impossible, and utterly untouchable. He had ties with the police, politicians, corporations, people who thrived in the gray space between law and chaos. Rachel knew that if this man had anything to do with her father, every answer she sought lay behind the walls he had built. On the wall of her apartment hung a map of the city, its surface webbed with red threads connecting points of suspicion, audio recordings, blurry security photos, irregular bank transfers. Her evidence wasn't enough to take to court, but it was enough to steal her sleep night after night. One building in the city's southern industrial zone had caught her attention: an old warehouse. No operating permit, no visible purpose, yet signs of recent activity. She had driven there twice. Both times she saw dim lights inside and trucks parked tight against the walls. The city's records listed the place as dissolved since the year 2012, but it still stood there, solid in concrete and steel, a silent monument to a truth no one had dared to touch. And on an early October evening, when rain was forecast but the wind had already risen before darkness fell, Rachel decided she would wait no longer. No one knew where she was going. No one imagined she was heading straight into the place where every secret she had chased for 8 years was waiting, or perhaps luring her in. She carried only a camera, a notebook, and the resolve of someone with nothing left to lose. The industrial streets were empty, no one paying attention to a lone car. She parked 3 blocks away, dressed in dark colors, walking like a city photographer or a student surveying old architecture. No one knew that the woman walking quietly into the dark was about to face something that would change her life forever and shake an entire network of power hidden deep within the city's veins. If you're still standing with Rachel now on the frozen riverbank of Chicago, on the thin line between survival and a secret buried for 8 years, perhaps you can feel your heart pounding as hard as hers. Before we move on to the next part, where the name Spectre begins to reveal a world Rachel never imagined, please subscribe to our channel, like and share this video so we can continue to explore stories full of mystery, emotion, and suspense together every day. And where are you listening from tonight? Leave a comment below and tell me which city or which rainy night you're in right now. I want to know where Rachel Monroe's journey and the name Spectre have reached your heart across the world. A cold winter wind swept down the empty street, carrying the metallic scent of rust and forgotten industrial decay. Rachel stood about 20 meters away from the warehouse, hidden behind an empty cargo container. Her eyes locked on the side door's cracked, paint-chipped surface. Everything around her looked abandoned for years, yet the silence was too perfect, as if someone had carefully built it to deceive. No light inside, no cameras, no guards, but it was precisely that absence that made her wary. Professionals never needed to show off. They let silence be their camouflage. She pressed close to the wall, her fingertips sliding along the cold steel panels until she found a gap near a welded window. She carried no weapon, only her camera, her notebook, and the sharp memory honed through hundreds of hours of investigation. The side door appeared welded shut, but when she pulled gently, it opened a narrow gap. Inside was a chill darkness, the air thick with rust and something stranger damp, acrid, the smell of things that should never exist in a legal warehouse. Rachel stepped in, controlling her breath, eyes adjusting to the dark. The space was vast and hollow, her footsteps echoing like someone else was following close behind. Faint light from high windows revealed scattered shipping containers, most sealed, a few open, exposing strange machinery, tangled wires, office equipment, and several wooden crates stuffed with folders. She approached one crate, took out her phone, and snapped photos of the printed codes on its surface. They didn't match any commercial shipment markings she knew. No corporate logos. No inspection stamps. Everything was anonymous, exactly how a network operates when it intends to stay invisible. Rachel moved deeper, weaving through a row of rusted shelves lined with moldy files in the corner. Suddenly, the first sound broke, the silence a heavy footstep, echoing from the far end of the warehouse. Then two more, steady and unhurried. Someone was walking in and they knew their way. Not a drifter, not a rookie, someone familiar with the terrain. Rachel turned instantly, searching for an exit. The door behind her had already shut without her noticing. No handle from the inside. She slipped between the shelves, heart pounding in controlled rhythm. A man's voice echoed ahead low, firm, with a northeastern accent, speaking in clipped, commanding phrases, at least 3 of them. They weren't rushing, they were hunting. Rachel sprinted along the side corridor, her sneakers striking the concrete floor louder than she wished. At the corridor's end was a loading exit leading to the dockyard beyond it, an open lot facing the Chicago River, the water black as ink and fast with the season's first rain. She knew she had no time. The voices were closer now. Metal clattered, perhaps weapons brushing steel. She broke into the open. The cold wind slashed across her face as she dashed across the dock. The river lay about 4 meters away, a sloped embankment leading down to old rail tracks now buried under weeds and gravel. She reached the edge, glanced down at the icy water, and didn't hesitate. Behind her, a door burst open. A sharp shout cut through the night, followed by accelerating footsteps. Rachel didn't wait. She jumped. The first sensation was wind, then impact like crashing into a wall of stone. The cold was so brutal her lungs seized, her body refused to move. Pain dissolved into numbness. Then chaos. She no longer knew which way was up. She tried to swim, but the current pulled her under. There was nothing to grab. No light. Only the roaring in her ears and the burning in her chest as her lungs screamed for air. She thought, is this how it ends? 8 years of investigation. 8 years chasing a shadow. And now, no one will ever know what happened. Just as her hands went limp, a force seized her collar and yanked her upward. Her face broke the surface like tearing through another world. Air rushed into her lungs. She coughed violently, water spilling from her mouth and nose. Her vision blurred by cold and tears. Someone was dragging her toward the shore, strong, deliberate, unyielding. A tall figure, drenched, blocking the floodlight behind him. A low male voice spoke beside her ear, steady, deep, wary, yet strangely warm. "You're safe now." And when Rachel opened her eyes, looking up at that face, a face she had never seen, yet somehow felt she knew, she whispered a name before her mind could even comprehend it. "Spectre." The man froze. The arm holding her stiffened. His eyes darkened, as if a door to some long-buried memory had just been forced open by the weight of that single word. Rachel didn't yet know that in that very instant, everything she had believed, persuaded, and suffered for was about to turn upside down. Rachel couldn't remember the exact moment she lost consciousness. She only knew that when her eyes opened again, the world had changed. There was no longer the sound of wind screaming across the rusted tin roof. No more river water cutting her skin like glass. Only the warmth of soft fabric against her body and the steady hum of an air conditioner somewhere in a room she didn't recognize. Pale light seeped through gray curtains, washing the space in an unsettling stillness. She lay on a wide bed, the sheets crisp and clean, carrying the faint scent of new fabric mingled with old wood, and something musky, yet pleasant, perhaps musk itself. She realized she was no longer wearing her old clothes. Instead, a loose cream-colored silk robe hung over her body. The realization jolted her upright in panic. Someone had changed her clothes. Someone had touched her unconscious body. The sense of violation crawled through her veins, making her fingers tremble. She tried to stand, but her legs gave out beneath her, as if the river was still clutching her somewhere deep in her mind. The door opened, before she could think further. A man stepped in tall, broad-shouldered, walking with the posture of someone who had never bowed to anyone. The dark shirt fit his frame with precision, the kind of fit that spoke of control over his body, over others, over every situation. Rachel recognized that face instantly. She had seen it in newspapers, on investigative reports, in files about untouchable figures in Chicago. Vincent D'Angelo, the real estate tycoon, the man behind a web of hidden deals that no one dared to call by their true name, crime. The man who had pulled her from the depths of the river as if she were something to be saved or hidden. His eyes stopped on her, scanning every detail the way she sat. The look in her eyes, the fear she tried to bury. But what sent a chill down her spine was not his stare, it was his calm, unhurried voice. "You've been unconscious for nearly 16 hours. Your body is recovering. You need food." Rachel clutched the edge of the robe, her voice raw and uneven. "Where am I?" Vincent walked toward the window, pulling the curtain slightly aside. Daylight poured in, revealing gray painted walls, dark wood furniture, and sharp, deliberate lines of design. "One of my private properties," he said without turning. "Secured. No one knows you're here." She nodded faintly. Of course, if anyone knew, she wouldn't still be breathing. "Why did you save me?" The question escaped before she could stop it. Vincent turned back. This time, his gaze held something different, not softness. Exactly. But something strange, like recognition mixed with disbelief, as if he were staring at a ghost. "Because when I pulled you out of the water," he said slowly, "you whispered a name I haven't heard in more than 10 years. Rachel stopped breathing. "Spectre?" He repeated the word as though testing her reaction. "I don't know if you understand what it means, but I do." "Very well." She bit her lip. The memory came rushing back like a sudden spark in her brain, the blurred image of her father speaking to a man in their old living room years ago. That man had been called by that strange name. Spectre. She hadn't meant to say it, but in that moment between life and death, the name had surfaced from the depths of her subconscious like an incantation. Vincent stepped closer, moving with the careful deliberation of someone approaching a dangerous secret. "That name," he said, "disappeared with the closest friend I ever had. The man who walked away without a word. The man I trusted completely. The only one who ever made me question the organization I built." Rachel stared at him, unblinking. He knew. Vincent D'Angelo knew who her father was. Knew he hadn't died the way the files claimed. Knew he had once held a role within the underworld she was now stepping into without realizing there was no exit. "Who are you?" His voice was low, tight, strung like a wire. Rachel drew a deep breath, willing her body not to shake. My name is Rachel Monroe, and he was my father. Vincent studied her for a long moment, as if trying to confirm what his mind refused to believe. Then he nodded slowly, no longer surprised, as though a fragment of his past, one he had buried so carefully, had just returned in the form of a soaked, stubborn young woman. We need to talk, he said, but not here. Rachel didn't ask where. She knew that the moment she stepped through this door, there would be no turning back. Just as her father had chosen a path 10 years ago and never returned, Vincent led Rachel into a room deep within the building, a place where the noise of the city could not reach, and every corner seemed designed more for interrogation than conversation. There were no recording devices, no unnecessary lights, only an old wooden table with 2 chairs facing each other, and a thin file resting in the middle, as if Vincent had been preparing for this moment for a very long time. He sat down first, unbuttoning the cuffs of his shirt sleeves, his eyes never leaving Rachel. And in that small gesture she understood this wasn't merely a conversation, it was a reckoning. She took a seat as well, her hands folded on her lap to hide the faint tremor in her fingers. Your father, Vincent began, was not the man you thought he was. Rachel remained silent, her eyes sharp, cold. He was my closest associate for 3 consecutive years. His real name may have been Richard Monroe, but with me, people called him Spectre. The name wasn't given because he was dangerous, but because he was silent, precise, discreet, appearing and disappearing like a ghost. He handled the most critical matters I couldn't entrust to anyone else. Vincent ran his hand along the surface of the table, as though retracing the past through its wooden grain. I didn't give him soldiers or weapons. I gave him land, projects, information. He knew how to turn an abandoned lot into a profitable asset worth 10 times its value in 6 months. He knew how to use legal procedures to shield illegal things. Rachel swallowed hard. Each word Vincent spoke tore at the fragments of memory she still held of her father, the man who had taught her to tell truth from deceit in a single sentence, the man who never missed her first days of school, her exams, her birthdays, until the day he vanished. And then one day, Vincent continued, his voice lowering, his eyes darkening. He left everything. No warning, no reason, no files taken, no explanation. He simply disappeared like smoke. Rachel lifted her gaze, her voice unsteady. Do you know why? Vincent shook his head, a faint, ironic smile brushing his lips. I thought he betrayed me. I truly did. I tore through every connection, examined every document he'd ever touched. But there was nothing. No missing money. No secret transfers. No contact with rivals. Just nothing. Rachel leaned forward. And you didn't try to find him? I wasn't allowed to. Vincent replied quickly. In this world, when someone leaves without permission, they've chosen a road with no return. If I went looking, I'd become the one who had to pass judgment. The air between them thickened. Something inside Rachel cracked open the part of her that had always believed her father was a victim. Now, the truth suggested he had chosen to walk away. Not out of fear, but intention. Vincent opened the file before him and pushed it toward her. Inside were old photographs, photocopied documents, contracts, construction permits, all bearing the name Spectre or Richard Monroe. One picture showed her father standing beside Vincent, both dressed in dark suits, smiling at the inauguration of a building Rachel had never heard of. Another showed a city map, red dots marking areas in South Chicago, the same zones that had become the center of the disappearances she had been investigating. I used to think you came here to dig for information, Vincent said, like a reporter trying to pry her way into a world she couldn't possibly understand. But now I see you're the last key left to explain why he vanished. Rachel felt as though her heart were being torn in two. One part of her wanted to preserve the image of a good man, a kind father. The other knew he had lived a life she'd never known. I don't know anything about any of this, she whispered. I just want to know why he left me without a word. Vincent stood, his expression softening for a brief moment. Maybe he did it to protect you. Then he turned and walked out of the room, leaving Rachel alone with the file. 1,000 unanswered questions, and a name that had once been a desperate whisper in the dark. Now the first piece of a fractured past slowly taking shape before her eyes. Rachel remained in that room long after Vincent had gone, as if moving even slightly might undo everything that had just happened and return her to the old world where her father was merely a diligent man who had vanished without a trace. But now, the file before her was undeniable. The photographs could not be forged. The signatures were too familiar. She reached out and touched the image of her father standing beside Vincent. They were both smiling, wearing dark suits. The backdrop, a newly inaugurated office building. Sunlight slanted across her father's cheek, illuminating his smile in a way that pierced Rachel's heart. She had never seen this photograph before, had never seen him smile like that during the last years before he disappeared. In the picture, he wasn't the weary man burdened by work or family. He was a partner, a friend, a part of a world she had never been allowed to enter. She turned the next page, a blurred photocopy of a land ownership contract in the Southern Industrial District. At the bottom was Richard Monroe's signature, the pen strokes firm and unmistakable. Her father had once taught her how to sign her name, guiding her hand so that the tail of each letter bent slightly, just like his. She remembered the first time he let her use his fountain pen, telling her that a signature was a mark no one could ever replace. Now, that same mark pointed to a truth she had never imagined. Rachel pulled another photograph from the file, smaller. Its edges yellowed with time. It was their old living room. She recognized herself, around 8 years old, sitting on the sofa with a glass of orange juice in hand. Beside her was her father, and on the other side sat a man she didn't recognize, younger than Vincent was now, but with eyes that could not be mistaken. It was him, Vincent, in her living room, before everything changed. Her hands trembled as memories surged like a flood long dammed. She remembered hearing her father call someone Uncle Vince, the deep, amused tone in his voice. She had assumed he was a coworker. She had never imagined he was the man who once commanded an underground empire so vast that newspapers dared not print his name directly. The realization made everything collide. If Vincent had once been that close to her father, why had his name never been mentioned in the years that followed? Why had her father never brought her near that world again? And why had he chosen to leave not just the organization, but her as well? The questions hit her in slow, heavy waves. She looked around the room. Daylight slipped through the window, dust drifting in the air like fragments of memory yet to settle. She rose and walked toward a built-in bookcase. Rows of documents were neatly labeled by year: assets, projects, communications, internal affairs. At the very bottom sat a wooden drawer with a mechanical lock. She tried the handle, and to her surprise, it opened easily without a code. Inside lay a single thin folder, unmarked. Within it were handwritten notes, pencil lines in the familiar hand of her father. If anything happens, trust no one except the one carrying this notebook. Rachel froze. Beneath the line were symbols, sketched diagrams, strings of numbers, some kind of code, too abstract to understand at first glance. But her instincts told her this was a sign, the beginning of a hidden record system. Maybe evidence, maybe an explanation. She clutched the file to her chest, her heart torn between relief and sorrow. Perhaps her father hadn't truly abandoned her. Perhaps he had left her these clues for the day she would be old enough, strong enough, to follow them to the end. Rachel turned back to the table, her gaze falling on the photograph of the three of them herself as a child between two men who had once been friends, partners, and now the two fragments she would have to fit together if she ever hoped to uncover the truth. For the first time in 8 years, Rachel no longer felt like a wanderer lost in a labyrinth of lies. She was standing at the threshold of something real. And perhaps it all began with the pages her father had left her, not as a goodbye, but as an unfinished promise. Vincent returned to the room after nearly an hour of silence, by which time Rachel had read and reread every line in her father's notebook until she could almost recite it from memory. He didn't ask what she had found. He simply pulled out a chair across from her, set down 2 steaming cups of black coffee and a new, thicker file, one that looked as though it had never been opened. Rachel didn't touch the coffee. She was still suspended between what she knew and what she was beginning to understand. Vincent studied her with the calm precision of a man long accustomed to tense negotiations. "I don't care why your father left those things for you," he said, his voice low and measured. "But it's clear he wanted you to continue something." Rachel nodded faintly, still holding the notebook tightly. "I think he didn't just want me to uncover the truth," she said softly. "He wanted me to finish what he couldn't." Vincent tilted his head slightly, as if testing the weight of her resolve. "Then I won't stop you. But I won't let you go in alone either." He pushed the new file toward her. Rachel opened it. Inside were city maps marked with circled zones, lists of names, photographs, addresses, and fragments of internal notes. One name appeared again and again: Dante Morelli. "He used to be one of the most trusted men in the organization," Vincent said. "Not anymore. He's behind the disappearances you've been investigating. I believe he discovered that your father is still alive, and he's erasing anything that could tie him to the past." Rachel looked down at the map, her hands trembling slightly. There were locations she had visited, names she had questioned. Each mark was a footprint from her 8-year search, now illuminated with an entirely new meaning. "So what do you want from me?" she asked, her voice rough. Vincent leaned back, his gaze unwavering. "I want you to keep investigating, but not as you did before. I'll have people watching over you, give you access to files that no one outside the inner circle has ever seen. In return, I need to know exactly what your father left behind, and if he's still alive. I want to speak to him just once." Rachel tightened her grip on the notebook. She wasn't sure she could trust Vincent. Only days ago, he had been the very man she was investigating. Yet he was also the only one who hadn't hidden the truth, who had, in fact, opened the door to the secret world her father once lived in. "I won't give you everything," she said slowly, "but I'll show you what's necessary if you truly mean to help me find the truth." Vincent was silent for a moment, then nodded. "We have an agreement." Rachel had never imagined she would strike a bargain with a man like Vincent D'Angelo. But now, between her and the truth stretched a network too vast, too intricate for one person to unravel. She needed protection. She needed information. And above all, she needed time. Because if Dante truly was hunting her father, the clock had already been ticking for far too long. When Rachel rose to leave the room, her eyes no longer held the quiet determination of a journalist. They carried the focus of someone stepping onto the same chessboard her father had once played on, only now. It was her turn to move, and she knew there would be no safe moves left. But if her father had risked everything to preserve a piece of the truth, she was ready to risk everything else to complete it. The next morning, Rachel sat alone in the attic room of the old building Vincent had arranged for her, a quiet refuge above the city where dust and sunlight mixed like the ghosts of forgotten time. In front of her sat a laptop, a notebook, and a thick file stamped "Internal Use Only." Morning light filtered through the grimy window pane, spilling across the pages and making the documents appear older, blurrier, as if the secrets they contained were dissolving into the air. She hadn't slept much, but her eyes were as sharp as they had been during her hardest investigative days. The first file was labeled Personnel Tracking, Restructuring Phase. Inside was a list of more than 20 employees who had worked under one of Vincent's real estate subsidiaries in the Southern Industrial District. But what drew Rachel's attention wasn't the names that remained, it was the blank spaces between them. Entire rows reduced to simple dashes. No tax records, no addresses, no photographs, no employment history. As if those people had never existed, or someone had deliberately erased every trace of them. Rachel opened her notebook and began cross-referencing with the data she had gathered over 8 years. Surprise followed surprise. One of the erased names was Patrick Linney, whose mother had once told Rachel that he vanished after being promoted to a higher position. Another was Elena Ruiz, a construction engineer who had posted briefly on her personal blog about odd budget allocations and blueprints that didn't match reality. The next day, every one of her social media accounts disappeared. Rachel also found 2 small local news reports mentioning the unexplained disappearance of 4 workers, all employed on the same housing redevelopment project in Little Village. No follow-up stories. No investigation results. No charges. Just another quiet erasure within a city too large for anyone to be held accountable. She returned to the original records, trying to trace the employee IDs. But every search through the city's database came back with the same message: no data found. That could only happen if someone with very high-level clearance had gone into the root system and wiped everything clean. She remembered Vincent's words. Dante Morelli had once been the most trusted man in the organization, and he was the one overseeing the very construction projects connected to these missing names. Rachel retrieved the map Vincent had given her the day before, aligning it with the project locations from that same period. A strange pattern began to emerge. Most of the sites tied to the disappearances clustered around newly completed infrastructure routes, pipeline corridors, utility lines, and parcels of land recently rezoned and transferred to new companies. Rachel circled the overlaps and felt a chill crawl up her spine. This wasn't coincidence. It wasn't personal misfortune. It was systemic. A manipulated network. Every erased name had once belonged to someone who spoke up, who questioned, who stood too close to the line between legal and illicit, and each had been removed from reality with surgical precision. Rachel jotted down every link, then reached for her phone and called Vincent. He answered after 3 rings, his tone alert but heavy. She didn't waste words. "I think I know what Dante is doing." Silence filled the line. Then Vincent's voice came. Slow, almost disbelieving. "What is he building?" Rachel stared at the map, filled with red circles. Her voice barely more than a whisper. "He's not building. He's covering. Hiding something beneath those legitimate projects." Vincent exhaled deeply. "And those people, they were the price." Rachel didn't reply. She knew he was right. Those erased names weren't just evidence of a crime. They were the last traces of people who had tried to stop what was happening. And now, if she didn't move faster than Dante, if she didn't connect the remaining fragments in time, there would be more names erased. Maybe hers, or maybe her father's if he was still alive at all. 2 days later, on a gray morning at the beginning of November, Rachel left Chicago and drove to Madison, Wisconsin, following the directions Vincent had given her the night before. They had agreed to keep their distance to avoid drawing attention, especially now that the name Dante Morelli had begun to resurface in internal meetings, accompanied by rumors about someone digging into a past that was supposed to stay buried forever. Madison was quieter, but not innocent. Vincent had told her that one of the last people to see Richard Monroe, her father, was a man named Harold Kane, now living in seclusion inside an abandoned auto repair station on the western outskirts of the city. He had once been a structural engineer specializing in underground infrastructure, responsible for drafting blueprints for one of Vincent's largest development projects. As she drove, Rachel felt the weight in her chest grow heavier. She didn't know whether this man truly existed or whether she was driving into a trap, but instinct told her she had to go. If Harold knew anything, he might be the final bridge between the present and the moment her father disappeared. She arrived just before 11. The old garage sat beside a narrow road, surrounded by wild grass and a few decaying mobile homes. A rusted metal sign hung above the entrance. Most of the letters faded, leaving only the word repair barely visible beside the outline of a wrench. She knocked 3 times. No answer. She turned to leave, then heard the slow creak of hinges behind her. A gray-haired man with stooped shoulders and hollow eyes, his face eroded by time and fear, peered out. He studied her from head to toe, his voice rough as rusted steel. "You're Spector's daughter." Rachel froze. No introductions. No explanations. He knew her as if he had been waiting all along. He opened the door and led her down a narrow corridor cluttered with parts boxes, tangled wires, and hand-drawn blueprints taped along the walls. The small room beyond was warmer than she expected. An oil heater hissed softly. A messy work table sat beneath a low window, and dozens of city maps spread across the walls, spanning from the 1980s to recent years. Harold poured her a cup of tea, his hands trembling though his eyes still carried the clarity of a man who had survived more storms than anyone guessed. "Your father didn't betray anyone," he began, as if he needed to say that before anything else. "He disappeared because he discovered what the whole system was trying to hide. Do you know about the fourth layer?" Rachel shook her head. Harold bent down and pulled a technical drawing from a drawer. "The fourth layer is an internal term. Chicago's underground infrastructure has 3 levels. 1, the sewers and basic pipelines. 2, the electrical and communication lines. 3, the secondary transport routes and maintenance chambers. But then, there's the fourth layer. It doesn't appear on any official plans. It was built beneath the third, used for transport that no one tracks, storage that no one inspects, and sometimes to hide people." A shiver ran through Rachel. "My father found that layer?" Harold nodded. "He wasn't supposed to. But during a final quality inspection on the Southern Tunnel project, he noticed a passage that didn't exist on the blueprints. It led to a sealed chamber, no exits, no purpose. And worst of all, it was guarded by men working for Dante Morelli." Rachel closed her eyes, imagining her father there, holding a folder, his calm expression concealing the realization that he was standing at the center of a storm no one else knew was forming. Harold's voice dropped lower. "He came back to me and said something was wrong. That what we were building wasn't just infrastructure. It was a system of concealment, a machine designed to cleanse the traces of crimes beneath the name of urban renewal. And then, he was gone." Rachel's throat tightened. "Do you know where he went?" Harold looked at her for a long time, then shook his head slowly. "I think he left to draw them away or to find a way to expose it all. But he knew that if he stayed, neither of you would be safe." Rachel bowed her head, tears rising but refusing to fall. She knew she was getting closer to the truth. And it was no longer just the story of a missing father. It was the story of an entire city that had learned to build bright, polished surfaces to hide the rot buried deep beneath. When Rachel left the repair shop in Madison, the afternoon light had begun to fade. Weak sunlight glided across the windshield, catching the exhaustion and confusion etched into her face. Yet something within her had shifted. Every word Harold had spoken had become a vertebra in the spine of a truth she had been clawing at in the dark for 10 long years. The nameless tunnels, the hidden layers absent from every official blueprint, the people who had vanished not by accident, but because they knew too much, and her father had been at the center of it all. She couldn't return to Chicago yet. Vincent had sent her a message, only 1 line. No punctuation, no name, no address. "Go to Oak Bridge Motel, room 14. It had arrived just minutes after she'd left Harold Zalda. There was no way Vincent could have known exactly whom she'd met, unless he was watching her more closely than she realized. But she wasn't surprised anymore. Nor was she angry. In the world they were stepping into, privacy had long ceased to exist. Oak Bridge was a 2-story wooden motel on the edge of a pine forest, about 15 minutes outside Madison. The air was so still that she could hear the dry leaves brushing the windows whenever the wind stirred. Rachel approached room 14 with an unnameable dread. She wasn't sure whether she wanted to see Vincent or someone else. When she knocked, the door opened. But it wasn't Vincent who stood there. It was her father. Richard Monroe stood before her alive. Older, thinner, his hair streaked with gray, his eyes no longer burning with the fire she remembered, yet carrying the same calm steadiness that had anchored her childhood. Rachel stepped back. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. He looked at her for a long time before opening the door wider. "Come in," he said, his voice low and rough, like someone who hadn't spoken to another soul in years. She entered as if in a dream and sat on the edge of the bed. Richard took the chair opposite, keeping just enough distance so neither would be pulled into the storm of emotion hovering between them. "I've been looking for you for 10 years, Rachel said after several long moments. "And all you left behind was emptiness and a question no one would answer." Richard lowered his head. "I know, and I'm sorry." The apology drifted out like wind but carried the weight of a decade. Rachel bit her lip, her voice trembling despite her effort to steady it. "Why? Why did you leave? Why didn't you send a message? A sign? Anything? Mom thought you were dead. I thought you'd been kidnapped, murdered, buried beneath some concrete wall. But you just disappeared." Richard inhaled deeply, his eyes locking on hers. "I didn't leave because I wanted to rude. I left because I had to, and because I knew that if I tried to contact you, they would find you. You'd be pulled into what I nearly died escaping." He reached into the nightstand, pulled out an old USB drive, and placed it in her palm. "Everything I know, everything I've collected, is in here. Proof of the fourth layer. The real maps. Recordings of meetings Dante never thought were being captured. The list of those who were silenced, and the payment routes that passed through 3 countries before returning to the real estate funds buried inside the city." Rachel closed her hand around the USB, feeling its weight like a stone in her chest. "You worked for Vincent," she said. "And then you realized it wasn't what they claimed it to be." Richard nodded. "At first it was for money. For influence. I won't deny that. But the deeper I went, the clearer it became that we were building something none of us could control. And when I discovered that Dante was using the projects to traffic people, hide bodies, and manipulate the city's administration, I knew I had to stop. But I couldn't do it from the inside." Rachel leaned back, eyes closed. For years she had prepared herself for this moment. Yet nothing in her imagination had prepared her for the reality of sitting across from the man she had mourned, a father explaining that he had let her suffer to keep her alive. Richard placed a hand on her shoulder, the first touch in 10 years that carried the warmth of a living father. "I've been watching you," he said softly. "You're stronger than I ever was. And now, you're the only one who can bring the truth to light and live long enough to tell it." Rachel turned toward him, tears slipping free. Unstoppable. She was no longer the 18-year-old girl left behind in silence. Now she was the torch standing before the entrance to the darkest layer of the city. And with his confession, she knew there was no turning back. The air inside the small room seemed to thicken after Richard's confession. Rachel sat in silence, her fingers clutching the USB as though trying to feel the true weight of it not in mass, but in everything it contained. 10 years. She had grown up with an emptiness that nothing could fill. She had traded her youth for clues, wandered through the darkest alleys of Chicago, drowned in files, rumors, and lies, and all that time, he had been alive, not imprisoned, not murdered, just gone. The truth hit her so hard her chest ached with anger. She looked up at him, her eyes brimming yet her voice cutting cold and sharp. "So you chose to leave. You never came back. You never wrote, not even a single line. Did you really think that would protect me?" Richard said nothing. He didn't look away or attempt to justify himself. His eyes were hollow, carved deep with the years of guilt that had eaten through him. "I did write," he said softly. "Many times. I recorded messages, planned ways to send them. But every time I tried, I saw you at 18 sitting in the living room with that lost look in your eyes. I knew that if you found out I was alive, you wouldn't stop. You'd come after me. And that would have meant death for both of us." Rachel pressed her hands together to stop them from trembling. "You didn't think I deserved a choice? You decided everything for me. You kept the truth locked away while I lived inside a nightmare of imagination." Richard leaned forward, his voice breaking. "Not because I thought you were weak, because I knew you were strong enough to do what was right. But back then, I wasn't ready. I was still trying to survive. I needed to end it before you were pulled in." Rachel rose and walked toward the window, looking out at the thinning woods beyond, where the last light of day faded behind the trees. She didn't know what to do with the tide rising inside her anger. Sorrow, longing all folding into one current she couldn't contain. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times, yet none of those versions had prepared her for what it felt like when truth finally arrived. Sometimes, she realized, truth doesn't heal. It only deepens the scar. Richard stood, moved closer but didn't touch her. He looked at the slight tremor in her shoulders, his voice low. "I don't expect you to forgive me. Not now. Maybe not ever. But you need to know everything I did was for you, whether you believe that or not." Rachel turned, her eyes dry but clear. Steady. I believe you, she said. But that doesn't make the pain go away. Richard nodded, his gaze dimming. He understood. He had carried that same pain for 10 years. They sat down again, this time closer. No longer two strangers bound only by DNA and fragments of interrupted memory, but a father and daughter trying to find each other in the ruins of a brutal truth. Rachel placed the USB gently on the table between them. "So what's the plan?" she asked. Richard looked at her, a faint glimmer of resolve lighting his eyes. "You have to take this to Vincent, but not all of it. Keep the section with the names of the officials. That's your leverage." Rachel nodded. "I understand." Richard drew a deep breath, as though summoning courage from the part of his past he had buried. "Then we expose Dante. Not with violence, but with light, and if necessary, with the return of a ghost he thought was dead." Rachel studied him for a long time, then gave a small nod. For the first time in a decade, she felt the fury inside her begin to quiet. Not because everything was right, but because she no longer carried the story alone. And within a truth carved by pain, there was still room for forgiveness. Not to forget, but to go on. Rachel drove back to Chicago before daylight broke. The sky hung heavy and gray, as if coated in a film of dust that muted the sleeping city beneath the damp chill of early November. Wind swept through the rows of high-rises, tossing stray newspapers along the sidewalks. She kept the radio off, made no calls, letting only the sound of tires gliding over pavement echo steadily like a heartbeat, trying to stay calm inside her chest. The USB her father had given her rested inside her coat pocket, close enough for her to feel it pulsing with every movement. A small piece of metal carrying a storm within it. And this time, Rachel was no longer standing outside it. She called Vincent as soon as she arrived. He answered in less than 3 seconds, his tone composed and deliberate, as if he had known she would call at that precise moment. They agreed to meet at an office building in West Loop, a place Vincent claimed was completely secure. But Rachel knew well, in the world they now inhabited, there was no such thing as safe. The office was on the 11th floor, overlooking a corner of the city where cranes still moved tirelessly, symbols of a progress that never slept. Yet beneath the spotless glass and sterile white lights lay a network of money, power, and unspoken corruption. Vincent was already waiting inside a small conference room. Alone, no guards, no assistants. The lighting was just bright enough to reveal the tension in his eyes when Rachel walked in and placed what she carried on the table without hesitation. A small silver USB. He touched it but didn't open it. His gaze stayed fixed on her. "You found him." It wasn't a question, it was a statement already confirmed. Rachel nodded. Vincent leaned back, silent for a moment, arranging invisible pieces in his mind before he spoke again. His voice low but certain. "I need to know how much of this ties to Dante, and how much of it can bring him down." Rachel said nothing. She reached into her bag, pulling out a printed folder, extracted and classified sections of the data. Inside were images, recordings, underground maps, system diagrams, and lists of names of those in positions to be bribed, silenced, or erased. Vincent flipped through each page, unblinking. When he closed the file, the room felt even quieter than before. His eyes met hers, not cold this time, but carrying a mix of respect and suspicion. "You realize this will make you the hunted," he said. It was a warning, not a threat. Rachel nodded. "I've already been hunted. I survived because I never carried enough of the truth. But now I do." Vincent rose and walked to the window, looking out at the city waking below. The people moving through its streets had no idea that games of power were being played above them, games capable of deciding the fate of thousands. "We need a strike they won't see coming," he said, still watching the skyline. "We can't hand this to the police or the press. We have to make him trap himself." Rachel stepped beside him. "And if he doesn't?" Vincent turned, a spark flaring in his eyes like a hidden flame finding air. "Then we light the fire first." She met his gaze, and for the first time, she felt they were truly on the same side, not a journalist facing a crime lord, but two people standing on the fragile line between justice and darkness. united by a single purpose: to expose the man who had manipulated this city for over a decade. As she left the building, Rachel didn't look back. She knew that from this moment on, she wasn't merely returning to Chicago. She was returning to face the entire truth, to confront her past and the forces that would rather see her dead than speaking. But she wasn't afraid, because this time, she held the truth in her hands. And sometimes, truth is more powerful than any weapon. Rachel sat alone in her small apartment on the 6th floor of an old building in South Loop, where the dim yellow light from the ceiling lamp spilled over a worn wooden desk scarred by time. In front of her glowed the computer screen, displaying the first draft of the article she was about to send. The headline was short, simple, yet heavy as a gunshot echoing through a silent night. The underground levels never built for the public. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, unmoving, not because she lacked words, but because she knew the ones she was about to type were not merely information. They were a detonation. She had spent hours cross-checking every data file on the USB, comparing them with the copy her father had kept, and verifying them against the documents Vincent had provided. Each detail, each diagram, each recorded conversation aligned into a single, horrifying picture. It wasn't just about hidden tunnels. It was about an entire system designed for one purpose: concealment and control. Behind the banner of urban redevelopment, infrastructure investments had been funneled into the creation of unregistered underground layers, spaces used for smuggling, for hiding people, for erasing problems from within. Engineers who protested had vanished. Workers who asked questions were transferred and never returned. Rachel had identified the names of at least 16 people who once appeared on employee rosters and then were deleted from the record entirely. Each name was a silent period at the end of a story no one dared to tell. She opened her notes and reread the lead she had written. 10 years ago, I lost my father. All I had was absence and a question that never found an answer. Today, I have the truth. But that truth no longer belongs to me alone. It belongs to a city forced to believe in lies. Her voice caught as she read it aloud, not from pain, but from knowing that in just a few hours, everything would change. She hit send, forwarding the draft to her editor at the Tribune, marking it urgent. In the body of the email, she wrote only one sentence: I believe in this enough to accept any consequence. Then she rose and walked to the window. Outside, Chicago moved as it always did. Trains slid through the night. Headlights carved silver streaks across wet pavement. The tiny figures below lived their ordinary lives, unaware that beneath their feet lay an underworld built from money, power, and silence. She heard her phone vibrate. A message from Vincent. It started. She knew what he meant, Dante. That the other side had sensed something shifting. Maybe someone inside had reacted. Maybe a bank account had just been frozen. Or maybe the name Rachel Monroe had appeared on a list labeled, "To be handled." But this time, she wasn't afraid. For the first time in 10 years, she carried not just a story, but the truth itself. A truth capable of collapsing an empire if brought to light the right way. Vincent had arranged an escape route, a safe house, and a few trusted people to watch her from afar. But Rachel refused to leave. She would stay at least until the article went live. Not in print, but online. At 8 o'clock the next morning, she had already scheduled the release with the technical team to ensure it reached nationwide distribution, with backup copies sent to 4 major newspapers, just in case someone tried to interfere. Returning to her desk, she looked at the screen, where a small confirmation window now glowed. The article is scheduled for publication. Rachel leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. No fireworks, no spotlight, only a woman who, after 10 years of chasing her father's shadow, had finally found her own voice, and with that voice, she was ready to make an entire city tremble. Near midnight, wind began to rise over the aging rooftops of South Loop. The sky above Chicago was shrouded in thick clouds, layered like secrets not yet ready to break open. Rachel stood by the apartment window, looking down at the empty street. Streetlights threw trembling shadows of trees against the pavement, and her palm pressed to the cold glass. In only a few hours, The article would go live. She had counted every minute since she'd scheduled its release, not out of fear, but because in the stillness she could feel something waiting to happen. She poured herself a cup of tea and sat down at the desk. Beside the copy of the dossier, marked in red, part of it would be published. The rest, the sensitive section containing the names of current officials and corporations, remained locked inside a separate encrypted drive, protected by the software Vincent had given her. They had agreed to hold that strike for later. Rachel knew she was sitting at the center of a storm invisible to anyone else. When she had left Vincent's office that morning, he had said only one thing: "You can't turn back now." And he was right, there was no return. She opened her laptop and reread the opening lines of her story. Each sentence cut like a blade through the mask the city had worn for too long. She no longer wrote as a storyteller chasing questions. She wrote as a witness, a survivor, the daughter of a man who had spent his life hiding the truth from those who would bury it forever. Her phone buzzed. A message from Vincent. "He's moving. My men confirm Dante just left his Edgewater residence off his usual route. He senses danger." Rachel didn't reply. She knew that if Dante was already in motion, it meant he knew, and he wouldn't wait for the article to go live before he acted. She rose, locked the door, and checked the security cameras Vincent had installed throughout the apartment. One of them flashed a low battery warning. She made a note. Replace the battery immediately. Every detail could mean the difference between surviving and vanishing like the names once erased from the files. She went into the bedroom, opened the closet, and pulled out a small suitcase she had prepared 3 days earlier. Inside were identification papers, cash, a backup hard drive, and an unregistered burner phone. She didn't know whether she would have to use them, but she understood that once light began to reach the darkness, anything could happen. Returning to her desk, she looked at the laptop clock. 2:47 a.m. The wind outside howled in long, uneven breaths, like a warning from the city bracing itself for what was to come. She thought of her mother, a woman who had lived most of her life with a silence that no explanation could fill. She thought of Richard, hidden away in a safe place, spending his days rereading old notes as if they were the final pages of his life. She thought of Vincent, the man who had once personified corruption, now the only ally she could trust. And then she thought of herself, of the young woman she had once been, sitting alone in a cold apartment, writing her first blog post that no one read, asking a single question: why did my father disappear? That question had led her to the very end of a labyrinth, and now she was about to be the first to raise a torch, guiding thousands of others toward what they should have seen long ago. When the clock turned to 3, Rachel felt no fear. She knew with absolute clarity that whatever happened next, her life already carried a meaning no one could take away. The night before the storm was the night of awakening, and she was ready to meet the dawn, whether it brought light or endless darkness. The article went live at 8 o'clock that morning, exactly as planned. Within 20 minutes, the front pages of the Tribune and 3 other major newspapers were splashed with the headline about the secret underground system and the network of vanished workers tied to Dante Morelli. Across social media, the story spread like wildfire. Hashtags began to appear on Twitter, Facebook, and TikTok, shared by activists, university students, and residents living near the redevelopment zones named in the piece. But Rachel wasn't at home watching the numbers climb. She was on her way to a predetermined meeting spot with Vincent, a small cafe in River North where they were to meet a new, unexpected witness who had come forward right after the article went public. The man had once worked for a satellite company that operated third-level pipelines and claimed to know how the fourth-layer tunnels were activated during so-called special events. Rachel and Vincent had agreed to meet in a crowded place for safety. Yet as soon as she stepped out of her car and crossed the cobblestone street, something made her stop. It wasn't a horn or a voice calling her name. It was a sensation, sharp, undeniable, that someone was watching. She turned. Everything looked normal, but it was the kind of normal that felt rehearsed. A black SUV idled across the street, engine running, but no one inside moved. A man in a delivery uniform stood near the corner, though he carried no packages. And then, before she could take another step, A figure brushed past her from the left. A faint touch to her shoulder. The contact didn't hurt, but it was enough for Rachel to realize something had been slipped into the pocket of her coat. She hadn't yet reacted when a loud crash erupted behind her as if something heavy had fallen. The fake delivery man lunged toward her just as the SUV doors flew open and 2 men jumped out. There was no mistaking it now. An ambush in broad daylight. In the heart of the city. Vincent burst out of the cafe at that exact moment. He didn't need to ask what was happening. His hand slipped behind his jacket. And Rachel knew what lay hidden there, the gun he always carried but never flaunted. The imposter rushed her first, but Rachel sidestepped, shouting as she stumbled back. The scream was enough to draw heads and buy a second of time. Vincent fired a single warning shot into the air. Panic rippled through the crowd. One of the men from the SUV pulled something gleaming, maybe a knife, but when the chaos grew and the distant wail of sirens reached their ears, he turned and bolted. The other was knocked to the ground by Vincent just outside the cafe door. Rachel was breathing hard. Her hand pressed over the pocket where the object had been slipped. When things finally calmed, the police arrived, followed quickly by Vincent's men. They led Rachel and Vincent out through a side alley, into a waiting car, and drove them to a safe house near Lincoln Park. Only then did Rachel unfold the small piece of paper she had found in her coat. It wasn't a threat. It was an address. And 3 handwritten words, The Insider. Vincent's eyes darkened as he read it. Dante already knew that the story wouldn't end with words, and now he was using his own people to strike back. Rachel understood the rules had changed. This was no longer about revealing the truth. It was about keeping it alive. She pulled out her phone and called Richard. After several rings, he answered, his voice steady as ever. "They ambushed me," she said quickly. "But I'm fine. And I think we just found someone who helped Dante run the system from inside." Silence held for a moment on the line. Then Richard replied, "Then it's time for me to come back. Not as a ghost of the past, but as a living witness." Rachel clenched her hand into a fist. In broad daylight, in the city that never slept, they had been attacked. But she knew such a reaction meant the article had hit its target. And with this new address, another door had opened, perhaps an opportunity, perhaps a trap. Either way, she would see it through, because now, the truth no longer lived only in words. It was out in the open, walking through the light, ready to fight for its own survival. The address on the scrap of paper led Rachel and Vincent to an abandoned office complex on the city's south side, near an old industrial zone that had long ceased operation. The 3-story building looked as though time itself had swallowed it whole, its glass panels cracked, its faded sign half erased, vines curling over the brick like veins on an aging hand. They arrived in the late afternoon, the weak sunlight slipping through the branches of dead trees, glinting on patches of old oil stains across the ground. Vincent kept his hand near the gun at his hip, eyes darting constantly, the seasoned vigilance of a predator who had survived too many hunts. Rachel followed close behind, her mind running through every possible scenario from a trap laid in advance to a desperate exchange. But what she didn't expect was that the man waiting in the dim second-floor room would be a face she knew too well. Marcus Delaney, Vincent's former chief security advisor, had disappeared from their radar nearly a year ago. He had once been the man behind the cleanups within Vincent's network, the one who protected informants, managed covert transactions, and ensured silence when silence was required. When Vincent began severing ties with his old organization, Marcus had been among the few retained. Then, without warning, he resigned, citing family matters, and vanished. Until now, Marcus stood leaning against a desk, unarmed, his expression cold as tempered steel, stripped of any trace of the loyalty he once displayed. Rachel entered carefully, keeping her distance. "You're the one who slipped the note into my pocket," she said. "You warned us about the ambush?" Marcus nodded, his gaze never leaving Vincent. "I used to think you could change the game, Vincent," he said quietly. "But I realized you only changed its face. This system can't be reformed. It can only be dismantled from within. And that's exactly what I've been doing." Vincent's jaw tightened. He knew Marcus was not a man easily moved by ideals. If he'd turned, there had to be something greater behind it. Rachel took a step forward. "You're working for Dante? Or are you the new Dante?" Marcus smiled faintly, not with menace, but with something closer to resignation. "I worked for Dante once, but he's nothing now, a desperate old man clutching at his fading power. I saw how he manipulated the board, how those tunnels were built, how every voice that questioned him simply disappeared. And I recorded everything. Not to sell, to hold, until the moment came to use it as a knife to split this world in two." Vincent's fists clenched. "Then why bring us here? What's your game?" Marcus stepped closer, producing a small recording device and placing it on the desk. "This," he said, "is the recording of a meeting between Dante and a city commissioner. They were planning a fake redevelopment project to legitimize a new underground transport route. There are names, and voice, financial blueprints, and a signature from someone inside the mayor's office." Rachel stared at the tiny recorder, feeling as if she were staring at a loaded bullet waiting to fire. "If you have all this," she asked, "why not release it yourself?" Marcus met her eyes, his voice low but steady. "Because if I did, I'd be dead within 24 hours. But you, especially you, Rachel, are already in the spotlight. They can't move that fast against you. They have to hesitate. They have to calculate. And in that hesitation, you can do what I can't. Bring it all into the light. Expose every last traitor." Rachel slowly picked up the recorder. She didn't trust Marcus completely, but she trusted evidence and, more than that, she trusted the strange way truth seemed determined to reveal itself through the unlikeliest of messengers. Marcus stepped back into the shadows, as if the meeting were over. Vincent said nothing as they left the building, but his eyes had changed. He knew that in a web this tangled, no one was ever entirely clean, and sometimes it was the traitor who held the final key to the truth. 3 days after the meeting with Marcus, the city of Chicago kept up its calm exterior as if nothing had happened. The rivers of cars on Michigan Avenue, the familiar calls of street vendors at the corners, people continuing to thread through streets that had been built atop invisible underground layers full of secrets. But behind that mask, a machine was running in silence outside formal law, outside public courts and verdicts, governed by decisions made in the dark by those who had once been part of it. Rachel sat in a small room of an unmarked riverside building where Vincent had convened his closest circle. None of them wore badges or held obvious titles. Yet each carried power in their own way, former agents, lawyers forced into exile, journalists who had been threatened into silence, and engineers who had once built the very subterranean levels they now sought to dismantle. On the large screen at the center of the room, a city-wide map of the underground system glowed with red markers showing intersections, caches, and sites of recorded anomalies. Rachel had just played Marcus's recording. Dante's voice had filled the hush like a confession captured. No one spoke at first. Then a silver-haired woman who had worked in the city's internal audit office broke the silence. "With this evidence, we won't need a trial. We simply need to show them what they fear most light." Vincent rose and moved toward the screen. "I agree," he said. "But we cannot release only a fragment. We must strike the core money laundering evidence. Personnel, lists, overseas investments funneled into redevelopment projects, and, most crucially, the roster of those erased from employment records." Rachel scanned the faces around her. They were no longer victims but survivors, people who had lost everything or been forced to be quiet to stay alive. And now that collection of loss had hardened into resolve. Justice, however, is never simple. In the dark, Dante was already striking back. Within 2 days, 3 people on the witnesses list had gone silent, 1 found poisoned, 2 missing without trace. Official police would not claim the investigation. Major media began retracting posts under pressure from sponsors. Rachel understood they were no longer fighting an information war but a power struggle of endurance and faith. She opened her laptop and projected a still from a security camera taken at an abandoned Western warehouse. A truck with fake plates, ostensibly carrying building materials. But the containers had shapes like surveillance rigs and retro military comms gear. This is where we believe the fourth layer communications hub operates, she said. If we can breach it and extract its data, we will have the chain of commands for Dante's transactions across the last 10 years. All eyes turned to her. A man who had once been on the domestic security team asked, quietly, "And if we're discovered?" Rachel's voice did not waver. "At least they will know we are no longer afraid, not running, not hiding." The meeting concluded with a daring plan. A 5-person team would infiltrate the warehouse within 48 hours, using false identities and electronic breaching tools. Rachel was not on the strike team, but she knew her role would be more hazardous. She would be the final keyholder, the one to release all data publicly if the others did not return. When she stepped out of the room, she looked up at the heavy gray sky. Rolling clouds from the north, the city below thrummed as if nothing had shifted. But beneath its streets, justice was moving quiet. Dangerous. And this time it would not wait for a courtroom. It would come in its own way, from the dark, but sure. That afternoon, as the last golden light spilled over the weathered rooftops along the Chicago riverfront, Rachel arrived at the meeting Vincent had arranged, not in a hidden room or secret headquarters, but in a small Italian diner nestled among immigrant storefronts, where the scent of molten cheese and wine somehow felt like a strange, fragile sanctuary in the eye of the storm. She stepped inside and saw her father sitting at the window table with an older man she did not recognize. Yet the moment her eyes landed on him, something shivered in the back of her mind, as if instinct were trying to recall a forgotten shard of memory. Richard rose and pulled out a chair for her. Rachel sat and studied the stranger while her father offered a short introduction. This was Louis Cardenas, a longtime friend and former associate from the early days of the underground projects. The name chilled her. She had seen it in her father's old files, always annotated with the phrase "whereabouts unknown." Now he sat before her in the flesh, wearing a weary but kind smile. Louis looked at Rachel with eyes that held genuine remorse. "Your father kept silent for years to protect those he loved," he said quietly. "But without you, the truth would have stayed buried forever. You have done what we lacked courage to attempt." Rachel nodded but kept watching him closely. Louis carried the bearing of a man who had once shouldered great responsibility and been worn down by time. His hand trembled slightly as he raised his coffee, his gaze often drifting as if haunted by the past. Richard's voice deepened. "Today your father wants you to hear it from Louis himself, because the end of this story is the part he holds." Louis exhaled and leaned back, looking out toward the window as the daylight faded, and then he began to speak, careful and slow, as if measuring each sentence. "When the subterranean project began, we thought we were building advanced infrastructure, improving transit, expanding storage, relieving the city until Dante arrived, and everything changed. He did not want an engineered system. He wanted a labyrinth only he could control." Richard interrupted. "At that time, both your father and Louis resisted. But Dante had more reach than we imagined. Officials, police, insiders at subcontractors." Louis nodded, eyes clouded. "I didn't leave," he said. "I was forced to leave. A staged accident made the world think I was dead for 10 years. Dante believed I was dead, but I lived in hiding, watching and waiting for a chance to undo the wrongs. And now, with you appearing and your article shaking him, I know the moment has come." Rachel folded back against her chair, a heaviness settling in her chest. She had not expected another man to have chosen silence to survive. Yet unlike her father, Louis had no one left to return to. Richard looked at his daughter, his expression softening. "You are not alone in this fight," he told her. "Those who erred once are ready to repair it, even if it costs the rest of their lives." Louis drew from his pocket an old map and spread it across the table. "This," he said, "is an early draft of the fourth layer, a prototype that was never digitized, and it contains a detail no one had noticed. An emergency exit leading from the central control hub to an abandoned chapel on the far western outskirts. If we want to strike at the core of their operations, this is the only route that goes unmonitored." Rachel stared at the map, her heart beating hard. Everything they needed to end the game might begin in the place everyone assumed forgotten. She took her father's hand and looked at him and at Louis. And in that instant, 3 people carrying 3 different pasts, One unspoken truth settled between them. They were no longer scattered fragments but a team. And the final storm was drawing near. That night, when Rachel left the small restaurant where she had met her father and Louis, Chicago had fallen into a hush. The empty streets washed in amber light from old street lamps that flickered like traces of memory. She walked alone along the cold pavement, the wind brushing through her disheveled hair after a long day. Yet her mind felt strangely awake. In her thoughts, the map Louis had given her still glowed with its hand-drawn lines and tiny symbols known only to those who had once lived beneath the city. She knew she was approaching the point of no return, and that realization made her think of Vincent not as an ally, not as the man once named by the system as an emblem of crime, but simply as a man, the one person who had never left her side, even when he should have. She called him without thinking, without planning, just needing to hear his voice, a lifeline holding her steady as the ground beneath her began to tremble. He answered after a few rings, his voice rough and low, the same as on all those nights they had talked in the dark while the city slept, two souls awake together guarding a secret no one else could understand. "Are you all right?" he asked. Rachel hesitated. "I don't know," she said. "I found the way into the control center. But if it goes wrong, none of us may walk out." Vincent was silent, then said softly, "If you go, I go." Rachel smiled faintly, her voice trembling not only from emotion but from a trace of fear. "I didn't call to make you follow me. I just wanted you to know that if anything happens," he cut her off. "Don't say if. We're not going to die. We're going to finish this." Rachel was quiet for a long moment, then whispered, "There's one last thing I need before it begins. Something I used to fear. But I don't want to carry it anymore." She heard him exhale, as though he had been waiting for that moment. "Tell me." Rachel stopped on an overpass where the highlights cast her shadow long across the cold concrete. "I've never known what to call what we have," she said. "You weren't the person I trusted at first, but you were the one who stayed when everyone else left. And if tomorrow doesn't come, I don't want to die without saying that I loved you. Not because you're a hero, but because you're real." Vincent didn't answer right away. She heard footsteps, the faint rustle of movement. Perhaps he had gone to the window. Perhaps he was searching for words that no one ever finds easily. Then he spoke. His voice roughened. Something caught in his throat. "I once thought there was no room left in me for feeling. That love was a weakness men like me couldn't afford. But you changed that. Step by step, question by question. Every time you faced the truth, even when it hurt, you made me believe again. I don't know if I deserve what you feel. But if this is our last moment, then know this: I love you. Not because of who you are, but because you're the only light in a world I thought was forever lost to the dark." Rachel closed her eyes, keeping the phone to her ear, letting his words sink deeper than flesh. In that instant, amid dangerous plans and hidden tunnels, ambushes, and the narrow line between life and death, there were only two people left, two who chose to believe in each other. No promises for the future. No romantic vows. Only two hearts, once torn apart by the past, now beating for something that made everything different: love, in the middle of the storm. And sometimes that love was the strongest force pulling people through the dark. Rachel looked up at the starless sky, and she did not feel cold anymore, because somewhere on the other end of the line, someone was waiting not to stop her, but to walk beside her. And that was all she needed. When the first light of that morning spread across Chicago's gray sky, the city moved as it always did, trains gliding along their tracks, commuters rushing down sidewalks, horns echoing through the crowded streets. Yet something essential had changed. Beneath the ground, where darkness had once ruled and secrets had been buried in silence, the first cracks of light had begun to seep in. After a covert yet precise raid, the data Rachel and her team had extracted from the underground control center was delivered to several independent investigative agencies. A list of implicated figures was now under scrutiny. Dante had vanished into the night. No one knew where he had gone, but the city no longer trembled at the thought of his return. Newspapers began restoring the articles once forced offline. Citizens started sharing their own fragments of experience, small, overlooked details that, when pieced together, revealed a truth larger than any single voice could contain. But for Rachel, victory did not feel like triumph. It was the quiet weight of someone who had just swum across still water, concealing a deadly current, carrying pain, betrayal, and questions that would never be fully answered. She was no longer the girl who had searched for her father in vain for 8 long years, nor the solitary journalist typing through the night in a narrow apartment. She was a survivor, a witness, and a bridge between shadow and light. Richard chose to stay in Chicago, no longer hiding. Louis opened a small legal office to help workers harmed by the underground project. And Vincent, after years of straddling 2 worlds, finally stepped into the light beside Rachel. Their love was quiet, without vows or grand gestures, but strong enough to weather any storm. This story, in the end, was not only about crime, nor just about a buried network of corruption. It was about courage, about standing tall within fear, about faith when everything seems lost, about family, about love, and about choosing to stand with the truth, no matter the cost. And dear listener, if you have stayed with us to the very last moment of this story, we would love to hear what you feel. What do you think about Rachel's journey and those who walked beside her? Did this story remind you of something in your own life? Have you ever been torn between love and danger? Between truth and safety? Between silence and speaking up? Please share with us the sincerity from your heart, because it is your voice that inspires us to continue telling meaningful stories. And if this story touches a part of you, please help us spread the message by liking, sharing, and subscribing to our channel, so that every day you can experience more touching, suspenseful, and profound stories about people. We believe that every story has a message, a value, and a reason to tell. Thank you for listening and feeling the story. Wishing you health, peace, joy, and fulfillment in life. Goodbye, and see you again in the next episodes.